Turkey's rate of inflation has risen to a 24-year high, and the country is on the brink of collapse if it can't do something about it. Prices are soaring, and Turkish people are struggling to maintain an even semi-decent standard of living. Worst of all, the 85% rate is so high that it has demolished every expectation set by the country's central bank. According to Reuters, Turkey expected year-end inflation to top out at 65%. Still terrible, but at least within expectations. It then expected a dramatic fall to 36% in 2024, signaling the success of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's economic policies. But that hasn't happened. Inflation's only gotten worse as the year went on, with a predicted, quote, peak between 70% and 75% in May 2024, now going completely out the window. That peak is below where Turkey's right now, forcing the country into climbing a new mountain for which it is not prepared. Rewind 20 years and Turkey has one of the most impressive economies in the world. The country was booming. Growth seemed unstoppable, but now it's on the verge of financial collapse that might require decades of recovery. How did Turkey end up like this? Part of the blame can be placed on the issues that are affecting the entire world right now. Inflation was rising everywhere for much of 2022 and into 2023. In the United Kingdom, for instance, inflation was on the rise throughout 2021, reaching a peak of 11% in 2022. That was way above the Bank of England's ideal of 2%, but the country is on the rebound. October 2023 saw the UK's core inflation drop to 4.6%, with the country's economic policies slowly addressing the issue. We saw a similar issue in the US. There, inflation peaked at 9.1% in June 2022. Though that country has enjoyed an even faster recovery, core inflation fell to just 3% a year later, with America's own 2% target clearly being in sight. In both cases and around the world, this rapidly rising inflation comes down to two issues: the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and the war between Ukraine and Russia. The former affected supply chains and raised manufacturing costs so much that companies felt compelled to raise their prices accordingly. As for the war, the widespread disruption it's caused in industry and energy has led to inconsistent pricing for almost 2 years. But here's the thing. Everybody has faced those problems, and while inflation has been an issue all over the world, no country has come close to hitting 85% that we're seeing in Turkey right now. The consumers are really feeling the pinch. According to CNBC, people are paying 99% more for food in 2023 than they were in 2022. Housing costs have shot up by 85%, and transport costs are up 117%. In a country of 85 million people, having the cost of living, especially in these essential areas, practically double simply is not sustainable. But why has Turkey been hit so hard by the inflation infection, while other countries have managed to at least get it partially under control? One word: Erdoganomics. President Erdogan's economic policy has always revolved around keeping interest rates as low as possible so the country's people can borrow more money. Erdogan also argues that the lower interest rates attract investment, which further fuels the Turkish economy. It's the approach that has been partially responsible for the man being in power for 2 decades. And when all is going well on the inflation front, it's an approach that can work well. So dedicated to this approach was Erdogan that he followed it in the aftermath of the massive February earthquake that killed 47,000 Turkish people and destroyed the lives of many thousands more. Erdogan's response was to convince the country's central bank to cut its main interest rate by 0.5%, down to 8.5%, continuing a constant decrease from the highs of 19% seen in March 2021. The bank, which may have well been the puppets for Erdogan's policies, said that these rate decreases were, quote, important to keep financial conditions supportive, to preserve the growth momentum in industrial production and the positive trend in employment after the earthquake, unquote. However, it's hard to see the move as anything but a ploy by Erdogan to increase his chances of re-election in the following May. It worked. Erdogan vowed to keep cutting interest rates if he was re-elected, and the Turkish people listened. But he's still in office. But now, he's being forced to oversee the fruits of his policies, inflation rates that are so sky-high that Turkey's on the brink of economic collapse. What's even more interesting about Erdogan's approach is that it flies in the face of traditional economics. Typically, a country with high inflation hones in on its interest rates. The idea is that by increasing interest rates, people are encouraged to save more and borrow less. This pushes down the demand for goods and services, forcing companies to lower their prices or they won't be able to sell anything. It's basic supply and demand economics. quell the demand and the supply will follow. It's the approach that the UK has taken, with its interest rates rising from historic lows of 0.1% in March 2020 to the current base rate of 5.25%. The cost of borrowing has gone up, leading to more of the population reining in their spending. And though the UK clearly still has issues with inflation because it hasn't hit its targets yet, it's on the way to getting back to its desired 2% rate. What Erdogan has done is taken the exact opposite approach. Worse yet, he claims that his approach will curb inflation when the evidence is clear that it's only exacerbating the situation. The impact on Turkey's population is clear. They're having to spend more than ever before to simply survive. But Erdogan's policies also haven't had the intended effect of attracting investment from overseas either, especially as the Turkish lira has collapsed in the wake of skyrocketing inflation. In June 2023, Al Jazeera reported that the lira had reached an exchange rate of 23.3 versus $1. The rate amounted to a low point in a slow decline that started all the way back in 2013. Coup attempts and political uncertainty created economic crises, with the pandemic only adding to Turkey's woes as bullish investors bet against the lira, leading it to constantly dropping in value. The trend has continued. On December 1, 2023, a trade could get 28.96 Turkish lira in exchange for a single dollar, with projections seeming to show that the exchange rate is only going to get worse for Turkey. The last 2 years have been especially difficult. Up to 2021, the lira had at least managed to maintain single-digit figures against the dollar, and it didn't even break the 10 barrier until that year. With what we're seeing now representing a massive acceleration in the devaluation of the currency, and if Emre Alkin, Istanbul Topkapi University's rector, is to be believed, Turkey's currency will never again return to the strength that it had prior to 2014. No one should expect this, he says when talking about the lira's potential reach to the heights it once had. There's an established market now. What will happen is that at some point the increases in prices and the lira's extreme worthlessness will stop. The only way this can happen is by increasing interest rates, with Alkin pointing out that only an extended period of delayed inflation will give any indication of the currency's true value. Why is a weak currency a problem? A weakened currency tends to signify ballooning inflation, which we are clearly seeing in Turkey, as well as a frail economic structure that forces a country to take drastic measures. With such a weak currency, Turkey sees the value of its exports decreasing, essentially meaning that it receives less than it should for the products it makes. By contrast, imports become more expensive because the currency is weaker than that used by the country that's selling goods. In simple terms, Turkey has to spend more for what it brings in and gets less for what it puts out. All of this has an impact on inflation and the possibility of external investment. With the prices of imports skyrocketing, Turkish consumers are less likely to buy products that come from overseas. That's bad news for investors, especially those focused on importing, because demand dries up and their supply can no longer sell. Instead, consumers focus more on cheaper domestic products, which has potentially a twofold effect. First, companies that may have exported their products can't do so anymore because demand is so high domestically that they're selling more than they normally would. Second, if you remember what we said about supply and demand in relation to inflation, that higher domestic demand creates an environment in which companies that previously exported goods can now demand more for them at home. Inflation is the result. Think about it. Why would a manufacturer or retailer cut their prices when demand is so high that they can sell for much more? Inflation occurs and keeps occurring until the demand dwindles. In Turkey's case, that situation might only come about if its currency stabilizes and then strengthens against the dollar, driving down demand for domestic goods by making imported goods more affordable again. It gets even worse for Turkey. According to Economics Help, Erdogan's justification for keeping interest rates low, higher interest rates hurt the poorest people, is incorrect. It points out that the high inflation is just as damaging, if not more so. After all, high interest means that people can't borrow as much money, but higher inflation means that they'll struggle to afford essential goods as the cost of living skyrockets, meaning what money the people do have can't go towards stimulating the economy. The organization points out that big businesses and affluent people have the means to shield themselves against those problems. They can buy foreign currencies, purchase assets that grow in value along with inflation, such as land, and invest in overseas companies. The working class don't have those options. More and more of their money has to go toward paying the bills, with even basic goods starting to be seen as luxuries, with actual luxuries simply becoming unaffordable. The result? Talented workers start moving overseas to get away from the quote brain drain that sky-high inflation causes. For instance, the national news reports that there's been an exodus of Turkish doctors. Starting in 2022, when 2,700 of the country's doctors applied for good conduct certificates. These certificates are traditionally requested by doctors who need proof that they've acted appropriately in their roles, making it easier for them to apply for jobs in other countries. What's especially worrying for Erdogan is that 2,700 applications are almost double the applications received in 2021, showing that Turkish doctors are grasping for life rafts to help them escape the sinking ship that is Turkey's economy. In this case, Turkey's people aren't only dealing with higher prices than ever before, but they're also experiencing reduced access to healthcare because so many doctors are leaving. As Economics Help points out, this is a trend that'll occur across the board. Talented workers who've trained to develop expertise will get frustrated by the fact that the money they earn doesn't stretch as far as it should. They'll become angry over low pay and living conditions, resulting in them plying their talents elsewhere. Turkey loses access to people who could play key roles in strengthening its economy, and its economic situation only gets worse. Now let's dig a little deeper. It's clear Erdogan's desire to keep interest rates low is at the heart of Turkey's massive inflation and has likely led to the devaluing of the nation's currency. And it's also obvious that his attempts to offer attractive interest rates are politically motivated. It was one of his election pledges after all. But Erdogan isn't a stupid man. Why would he try so hard to stick to these low-interest policies even when basic economics tells him that the only way to tackle Turkey's inflation is to raise interest rates? Turkey's economic boom period holds the answer. High inflation is hardly a new issue for Turkey. Between 1975 and 2004, the country was weighed down by chronic inflation, from which it could only find relief through investments and increasing its employment levels. But even with those measures, Turkey struggled. In 2003, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. The Justice and Development Party (AKP) rose to power, with Erdogan at its head, and implemented reforms that led to the country's economy becoming a success story of the early 21st century. Growth seemed unstoppable. Between 2002 and 2007, the country's economy grew by 7.2% every year, with only the global financial crisis of 2008 slowing it down. Even in the face of the financial crisis, Turkey managed to achieve a 0.6% growth, with its inevitable recession only lasting for a year and causing a contraction of 4.6%. From there, Turkey started firing on all cylinders once again. In 2010, 8.8% growth was achieved, while the following year was even better, achieving 9.2% growth. Erdogan was flying high. Turkey was fast evolving from an also-ran in European economics to one of the continent's powerhouses. Several factors influenced this boom period. Turkey's position as a meeting point between Europe and Asia helped, as did the AKP's policy of encouraging a constant flow of overseas investments. The country's growing population, coupled with Erdogan's ability to use that population to strengthen Turkey's domestic output and thus its economy. For 10 years, Turkey's inflation was stabilized and manageable, likely making Erdogan feel like he was some sort of financial genius. Even if he didn't believe that, the Turkish people were clearly reaping the rewards of AKP's policies, and it was all underpinned by one thing: low interest rates. Or at least lower rates than the Turkish people had experienced for decades prior to the rise of Erdogan. According to CEIC, which charts global economic data, Turkey's interest rate tracked at an average of 10% between June 1996 and October 2023. But most importantly, AKP was responsible for driving that rate down lower than it had been for decades. From a record high of 150.16% in December 1999, which made borrowing practically impossible, Erdogan's policies led to a record low rate of 4.5% in December 2013. The message, at least to Erdogan, was clear: low interest rates are the reason why Turkey's economy boomed. By offering cheap finance, he empowered Turkey's people to spend more. That was especially advantageous for an economy that heavily relies on imported goods, even to support its domestic manufacturers, with the increased spending power created by lower borrowing costs catapulting Turkey into having the world's 20th largest economy. Low interest rates led to success. Poverty rates dropped from 18% from a previous high of 44%, according to Arab News, and Turkey was looking like a financial powerhouse in 2013. But the good times couldn't last forever. Slowly but surely, all of the success achieved during the AKP's first decade in power has whittled away over its second decade. Inflation is back to highs the country hasn't seen for decades, and Erdogan's low interest rates are as much to blame for that decline as they were responsible for Turkey's best economic period. Turkey has its back against the wall. The question now is simple: how can it respond? The answer seems to be by forcing Erdogan to break the very promise that he made during his re-election campaign. While he is still telling the Turkish people that low interest rates are the key to economic prosperity, the reality in Turkey is very different. The BBC reports that in November 2023, the country's central bank raised rates to a staggering 40%. That's a far cry from the 8.5% seen in February that same year, and it caps a swift turnaround in economic policy. It came quickly, too. August saw the central bank raise rates to 25%, with further raises between then and the latest leading to it being 35% at the beginning of November. The bank isn't using the small rises other nations have leveraged to curb inflation. There's no hemming and hawing about an extra 0.25% here or 0.5% raise there. Turkey's central bank doesn't have that luxury, with its latest rise being 5%, almost equivalent to the UK's current base rate. The central bank says the move is essential, raising interest rates so drastically, flying in the face of Erdogan's campaign promises in the process, will slow the pace of monetary tightening, with this cycle being completed in a short period of time. In other words, Turkey will be taking the approach that practically every other country dealing with an inflation crisis has taken. The hope is inflation will come down and Turkey's currency will start strengthening again. Where does all this leave President Erdogan? Frankly, he's caught between a rock and a hard place. His promise to keep interest rates low was broken mere months after his re-election. And even then, he just barely scraped through, achieving a slim majority of 52% to stay in power. All of which points to Erdogan's influence starting to wane as Turkey feels the economic pinch. That's an important point because there is no denying that Erdogan has played a role in the central bank's failure to increase interest rates over the last few years. According to Arab News, October 2021 saw him dismiss the central bank's deputy governor, Semih Tuman, from his role. An economics professor, Tuman was the fourth deputy governor of the bank to get the sack in as many years, pointing to Erdogan clearly having a belief that anybody who opposed his low-interest policies had to go before they could stop him. He did the same with Turkey's finance ministry. In 6 years between 2015 and 2021, the ministry has seen 5 different heads. There's a clear conflict at play here, with Arab News reporting that some of those heads left because they were too independent-minded for Erdogan to influence them. Others were removed because they followed his policies too closely, with the central bank highlighting that they weren't suitable either. It all points to a man who is so stuck in the success that he achieved with a policy that he can't see the very same policy is now the cause of Turkey's downfall. Erdogan's hubris, perhaps even his arrogance, is on full display to the Turkish people, and that might mean his 20-plus-year reign as president is on its last legs. But hey, at least Turkey is taking the right steps. Interest rates may be at extreme highs, but as other countries have proven, that should help the country bring inflation down to manageable levels. Or it could were it not for one last addendum to the story. Turkey's inflation may be even higher than official figures indicate. In October 2022, Turkey faced nearly the exact same crisis that it faces right now. Inflation reached a staggering 85.51%, only matched by the figures we saw in November 2023. Only one organization says that situation was far worse than it appeared. Turkey's Inflation Research Group, ENAG, which is a collective of independent economic academics, said that the October 2022 rate wasn't 85.51%, it was 185.34%. That's more than double the official claims, and it gives a rise to a disturbing possibility. If ENAG is right, then Turkey's inflation woes run far deeper than the rest of the country even realizes. After all, this isn't the first time that ENAG has accused the official figures of being wrong. Back in 2020, the same year as the group's formation, it said that consumer prices had tripled compared to the official figures released by the Turkish Statistical Institute, where the TÜİK claimed consumer prices rose by 0.97% in September 2020. The ENAG said the actual increase was 3.61%. The group's head Veysel Ulusoy explained the disparity in an interview in which he said that the TÜİK gathers 550,000 prices for basket items per month to reach its findings. According to Ulusoy, ENAG calculations include several times more than that, constructing a richer set of data. That raises an interesting question. Who's right? If it's the TÜİK and the official figure is 85%, then Turkey is facing an economic crisis that could doom the country to financial woes for decades. But if ENAG is right and inflation is over 100% higher than the official claims, we might be seeing the end of Turkey as we know it, and almost certainly the end of President Erdogan's glory days. The only thing that is certain right now is that Turkey is likely to see even higher interest rates before things start getting better. The country is drowning in inflation, and the strength that Erdogan worked so hard to build during his first 10 years in power is on the brink of crumbling down around him. But what do you think? Is Turkey's situation, as dire as it seems, the death knell for one of the world's most powerful economies? Or perhaps Turkey's better late than never approach to increasing interest rates will be enough to save it from crisis? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thanks for watching the video.